Montana Territory, 1889. Some houses carry the smell of an ending in them before you cross the threshold, and Clara Whitmore recognized that particular scent the instant Dr. Farrow walked her up the back stairwell above the dry goods store in Cedar Hollow. Nathaniel Cross lay propped against pillows that had seen too many washings to stay white, his shirt hanging open at the neck, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cold air pouring through a cracked window. He'd been trampled by a spooked horse 11 days earlier while breaking a young gelding out past the north fence line. The injury to his ribs had seemed manageable at first, then something inside had shifted wrong, and now his breathing came in shallow, wet pulls that told anyone standing close enough exactly how this story usually ended. Dr. Farrow hadn't minced words in the hallway. He gave the man until the weekend, if that. In the corner of that upstairs room sat a girl, no older than 6, perched in a chair built for someone twice her size, her small hands folded in her lap like she'd practiced holding still. She watched her father the way children watch storms, quietly from a safe distance, already braced for what was coming. "Mrs. Whitmore," Nathaniel said, his voice scraping out like gravel underfoot. "Thank you kindly for making the climb. Doc mentioned you'd be willing to talk business." "Not business, exactly," he corrected himself. "A proposition, if you'd hear one out." Clara glanced toward the girl in the corner. The child returned her gaze without a word, old enough to sense that some conversations weren't meant for young ears, and young enough that the silence cost her something anyway. "I'm listening," Clara said simply. He gathered his breath like a man rationing the last of something precious. "I need you to become my wife," he said, "before I run out of time. Not for my sake, for Josephine's." Clara didn't rush home to mull it over. Instead, she walked the length of Cedar Hollow's one real street, because a town that sighs hands out its history to anyone who looks like they might be about to join it. Miss Aldridge behind the dry goods counter offered up the details unprompted while measuring out coffee beans, the way small-town shopkeepers always seem to know exactly what a stranger needs to hear. Nathaniel Cross married Evelyn Prescott 8 years back, he said, against her family's wishes, mind you. The Prescotts run the largest sheep operation this side of the territory line. Good money mostly, though a bad drought could bring even a man like Prescott to his knees, same as anybody. He never did forgive Nathaniel for taking his daughter off that big spread and into a 2-room house with a leaking roof outside, beating dust from a rug on her porch railing. A widow named Mrs. Kettering picked up the thread without needing to be asked twice. The way grief gets passed hand to hand in towns too small to keep anything private. Evelyn passed 2 winters back, she said. Pneumonia, same illness that nearly claimed Nathaniel once before. The girl was only 4. Prescott showed up to the funeral dressed sharper than the occasion called for and told half the church, loud enough for the grieving husband to hear every word, that his granddaughter belonged on Prescott land, where she'd be raised the way a Prescott ought to be raised. Mrs. Kettering snapped the rug harder than the dust required. "He's said it every chance he's gotten since," she added. "Says it like it's already decided." Clara kept walking past the schoolhouse, past the blacksmiths, piecing together the shape of a dying man, a motherless girl, and a wealthy family that had been announcing its intentions in public for 2 years running. By the time the road bent toward the Cross homestead at the edge of town, she understood enough of the picture to carry back up those stairs. "You want to marry a woman you barely know past a handshake," Clara said, once she was back in the sick room. "I know your circumstances," Nathaniel answered. "Doc told me plain, widowed, no kin nearby, taking in sewing work to cover your rent above the milliner's shop. I'm not asking for affection. I'm asking for a wife legal, filed at the courthouse. Not some arrangement that dissolves the moment I happen to keep breathing. If I die tomorrow, you become Josephine's mother under the law, full stop. If I don't die tomorrow, and Doc's been wrong plenty of times before, ask him yourself. You're still my wife. I won't have you thinking you can walk once I'm sitting up and eating solid food again. This is a marriage I'm offering, not a temporary favor with an exit clause built in." Clara sat with that a long moment. It struck her as either the most honest proposal she'd ever received or the most reckless. "Why does the legality matter so much to you?" she asked. "That you'd spend what strength you've got arguing the fine print." "Because her father wants my daughter," Nathaniel said. "And a will can be dragged through court for years, but a standing marriage is a harder thing to argue against." Prescott's a man who's never once heard the word no and accepted it. I need something even his lawyers can't unravel. There's a will besides Doc's drafting it now, naming you guardian outright, regardless of what happens to me. But the marriage is the piece that holds even if a judge decides to pick the will apart. And what exactly do I gain from this, Clara asked, besides a dead man's last name, or a living one I never chose for myself? Nathaniel managed something close to a smile. The house is paid in full. The land's modest, but it's mine outright. Prescott never got his hands on that much of me. 9 head of cattle, a well that hasn't run dry in 8 years, and a daughter who needs somebody in her corner. I won't pretend that's a small thing to ask. It's about as large a thing as exists. I'll want everything in writing, Clara said. Every term spelled out plain. Doc's drawing the papers as we speak, Nathaniel told her. I had him start before I ever worked up the nerve to ask you. They wed on a Friday morning in that same upstairs room. The circuit preacher, a soft-spoken man named Elias Kane, happened to be passing through Cedar Hollow on his usual loop between 4 scattered townships, arriving at the precise moment small towns like to call fate, and everyone else calls coincidence. He read the vows quickly, aware the whole while that the doctor standing at the bedside kept one hand resting lightly on Nathaniel's wrist, checking his pulse without bothering to hide it. There was no music, no flowers, nothing but a girl standing near the doorway in a dress buttoned to her chin, watching the ceremony with the solemn attention of a child attending a funeral that simply hadn't happened yet. Clara wore the same traveling dress she'd arrived in Cedar Hollow wearing 3 months prior. "Do you take this woman?" the preacher asked, and Nathaniel answered, "I do," before the sentence had even finished leaving Kane's mouth, because he had no way of knowing how many sentences he had left to spend. Clara said her own vow slower, more deliberately, because unlike her husband, she fully intended to honor every syllable of it. When it was finished, the preacher closed his book and studied the pair of them with an expression suggesting he'd married a great many couples along his circuit, and never once under quite these circumstances. "Mrs. Cross," he said, testing the sound of it. She didn't correct him. It was, after all, the truth now, a fact recorded, whatever came after. Josephine crossed the room once the preacher had gone and stood at the foot of the bed, looking up at her new stepmother with open, searching eyes. "Are you staying?" she asked, "no matter what happens?" The question landed heavier than a child's question had any right to land. "I signed my name saying I would," Clara answered. "Papers like that don't change their mind just because your father does something as ordinary as staying alive." Josephine considered this with the gravity of someone twice her age. "All right then," she said, and climbed up beside her father to take his hand because whatever else had shifted in that room, that particular fact hadn't moved an inch. Clara moved her belongings into the small house that same evening, a good stove, a garden gone wild with weeds, a rocking chair by the window that had clearly belonged to someone else once. For the first week, she fully expected to bury him before the month was out. Doc Farrow came twice daily, packing the wound with carbolic when he had it and whiskey when he didn't, telling her plainly without dressing it up that the nearest proper surgeon sat 4 days' ride away and that Nathaniel would either mend on what little they had or he wouldn't. It wasn't cruelty in his voice. It was respect. He'd sized her up as a woman who wanted the truth straight, not softened. She cooked what she could. She changed linen soaked through with fever more nights than she cared to count. She read to Josephine after supper from the single dog-eared book in the house, watching the girl mouth along with sentences she'd clearly memorized in her mother's voice long before Clara ever arrived. On the 6th night, the fever spiked without any warning at all. Nathaniel's breathing turned shallow and fast well past midnight, his skin scalding under her palm in a way it hadn't the nights before. She sent Josephine running for the doctor with a lantern swinging wildly in her small fist, and for nearly 2 hours, Clara packed the wound fresh and coaxed water past cracked, trembling lips, believing plainly, the way you believe an arithmetic fact, that she was about to become a widow before she'd finished settling into being a wife. Near 3 in the morning, the fever finally broke and began its slow retreat. Doc Farrow sat back on his heels, gray with exhaustion himself. "That's likely the worst of it," he said quietly. Or it very nearly wasn't. On the 7th night, once the crisis had passed and the little house had gone still again, Nathaniel woke enough to find Clara sitting at his bedside instead of his daughter. "She ought to be asleep by now," he murmured. "She is," Clara said. "I sent her down an hour back." He studied her in the low lamplight. "You didn't have to sit up," he said. "Not after the night you just had. You must be dead on your feet." "I know," she said. "Why then?" he asked. She weighed the question honestly before answering. Because somebody had to, and there wasn't anyone else standing in line for the job. I want to pause the story right here for a second, because this is the moment everything quietly turns, and I don't want to rush through it. Stories like this one have a strange way of traveling, reaching a kitchen table in one country, a phone screen in another, a quiet porch somewhere entirely different. That kind of reach isn't something I take lightly, not for 1 second. If this one's got you leaning forward already, a like genuinely helps more than you'd guess. And I'm curious, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? Drop your country down in the comments. I read every one of them. Now let's get back to that little house, because Nathaniel Cross is about to do something Doc Farrow never once expected out of him. On the 9th morning, Doc Farrow examined the wound and went unusually quiet. A quiet that made Clara's stomach drop cold until she realized it wasn't grief settling over his face. It was disbelief. "It's closing up clean," he said. "I've seen this maybe twice in over 20 years of practicing medicine." He looked toward Nathaniel, upright against the pillows for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, but undeniably stubbornly alive. "I won't pretend I can explain it," Farrow admitted. "Some men just refuse to go when they're owed." Josephine made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh and threw herself against her father's chest. Nathaniel, who hadn't shed a single tear through 11 days of dying, wrapped his arms around his daughter and let this one moment finally break him open. Clara stood by the window and watched the two of them, and something moved through her chest she couldn't quite name at first. Grief she understood intimately. She'd buried a husband once already back in Ohio, and grief had a shape she could have sketched, blindfolded, hollow, and familiar, almost restful in the way it asked nothing further of her once it settled in. This wasn't that. This was her chest going tight over a man who was now, as of that very morning, permanently and legally her husband. A near stranger she'd known barely 2 weeks. A name she'd taken fully believing she'd be widowed within the month and left to raise his daughter alone with a clean conscience and a closed chapter behind her. Nathaniel Cross wasn't supposed to survive this. Now he had, and there was no closed chapter waiting for her anymore, and she had absolutely no idea what came next. That realization frightened her considerably more than his dying ever had. Recovery crawled slower than dying had, in its own strange way. Nathaniel couldn't work the land for close to 2 months, and Clara found herself splitting her days between ranch chores and housework because there was simply no one else to hand the work to, and she'd never once in her life left something undone for lack of extra hands. Without ever discussing it out loud, they slid into a rhythm. She cooked and mended fence wire from a stool when her arms allowed it. He directed Josephine through the chores he couldn't reach himself. In the evenings, the three of them sat at the same worn table, speaking like two adults quietly negotiating terms. Neither one wanted to name directly. "You didn't have to stay once the danger passed," Nathaniel said one evening after Josephine had gone to bed. "I know what the papers said," Clara answered. "That's not the reason I stayed." "Then why?" he pressed. "Because I gave my word," she said, "and I've never learned how to give one and not mean every part of it. And because your daughter asked me on our wedding day if I'd stay no matter what happened, I told her I would." I wasn't about to make myself a liar in front of a 6-year-old over a technicality. Nathaniel turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "That's not nothing," he said. "Most people would have called that reason enough to leave with a clean conscience." "I'm not most people," Clara said, an edge creeping into her voice, not unkindness, just the edge of a woman tired of being underestimated her whole life. Nathaniel looked at her like he wanted to say something more, watched it gather behind his eyes, then let it go instead, and turned toward the fire. "No," he said finally, "I don't believe you are." They arrived on a Sunday afternoon in a polished buggy that looked entirely out of place on the rutted dirt road leading up to the house. Old Man Prescott and his wife, dressed as though for a funeral that had never actually occurred, having only just learned weeks late that Nathaniel Cross had failed to die on schedule. "Word reached us you'd remarried," Prescott said, not bothering to climb down from the buggy. "Quick work for a man on his deathbed." "I was on my deathbed when I did it," Nathaniel answered evenly. "I'm obliged to Doc Farrow and to my wife that I'm not there any longer." Prescott's eyes cut toward Clara, standing on the porch with a hand resting on Josephine's shoulder. "We came for the girl," Mrs. Prescott said, gentler than her husband, but not gentle enough to soften the words. "We're prepared to give her a proper upbringing. Everything this," her gaze swept briefly across the modest house, "simply cannot provide." "She's not going anywhere," Nathaniel said. "I'm alive, and she has a mother in this house, legal, filed at the courthouse. No court in this territory hands a living child from two living parents over to grandparents who visit twice a year at best. We are her family." Prescott snapped, an edge sharpening in his voice now. "So is she," Nathaniel said, resting his hand briefly on Clara's shoulder, the first time he'd touched her in front of another living soul. Prescott's jaw tightened visibly. "There are lawyers in Helena," he said, "who'd take considerable interest in how fast that marriage was thrown together and whether a man half out of his mind with fever was fit to consent to anything at all. I'd think carefully before getting too comfortable, Mr. Cross." He didn't wait around for a response. He turned the buggy and drove off. And this time Josephine watched him go with her jaw set in an expression that belonged to someone far older than 6. "He means it," Clara said quietly, once the dust had settled behind them. "That wasn't a man leaving empty-handed. That's a man heading straight to a lawyer's office." She was mending one of Nathaniel's shirts on the porch a week later, needle moving steadily through a tear at the elbow, when she found the missing button. It had come loose during the worst of the fever nights, and she'd meant to sew it back on and simply never had, and somewhere along the way it had ended up tucked inside the little tin box where she kept her sewing needles. Not lost, not discarded, kept. She sat there turning it over in her palm for a long moment before she fully understood what she'd done without ever deciding to do it, and set it down like it had scorched her fingers a little. Nathaniel's boots on the porch steps a minute later made her look up before she'd sorted out what her expression was doing. "You're mending my shirt," he observed, easing himself into the chair across from her with the careful movements of a man not yet fully trusting his own healed body. "Somebody has to," she said, echoing her own earlier words without meaning to. He watched her work in silence a moment. "Clara," he said finally, "can I ask you something? And you tell me plainly if it's not my place to ask." "You generally do anyway," she said. "Prescott said something about whether I was fit to consent, half out of my mind with fever the day we married. I wasn't out of my mind. I want you to know that clearly. What I didn't know, what I'm not sure I let myself admit even to myself, was that I was asking for something for me too, buried underneath asking for Josephine's sake. I've told myself for 2 months this was only ever about her. I don't believe that's the whole truth anymore, and I think you deserve to hear me say so, even if I've been slow getting there." Clara's needle went still in her hand. "Why slow?" she asked. Nathaniel looked out toward the mountain range before answering. "Because Evelyn's been gone 2 winters," he said, "and wanting something else again felt like a betrayal, even after all this time, even knowing she's not coming back. Wanting felt like proof I hadn't loved her enough the first time around." He looked back at Clara. "I don't believe that anymore. It just took me longer than it should have to stop believing it." Clara turned the button over once more in her closed fist before answering. "I know something about that particular kind of slow," she said. "I've been working through my own version of it since Ohio." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried out from town by Mr. Aldridge himself, handed over with the particular gravity that shopkeepers and postmasters reserve for correspondence they suspect will cause trouble. Nathaniel read it once at the kitchen table, then a second time, and set it down without any expression at all, which Clara had learned by then wasn't calm, but the exact opposite of calm. "Prescott's filed a custody petition," he said, "through his lawyers over in Helena. Hearings set 3 weeks out in front of Judge Ashworth at the county courthouse. They intend to argue the marriage was made under duress, a dying man not fit to consent, and that, regardless, Josephine's better provided for on Prescott land than here with us." Josephine, sitting quietly at the table over her supper, went very still, the way she'd learned to go still whenever grown-ups argued around her like weather rolling in. "Can they win?" Clara asked. "I was clear-headed," Nathaniel said. "Preacher Kane will testify to that himself. He read the vows. He'd know a man who wasn't fit to speak them. But Prescott's got money for lawyers I simply don't have, and a judge who might owe him favors I can't begin to guess the shape of. He looked at his daughter, then at Clara. I won't lie to either of you and call this a sure thing. Clara set down her fork deliberately. Then we walk into that courtroom together, she said. Not as some favor I once owed you, and not as an arrangement anyone has to explain away. As his parents. Both of us. That's not a difficult thing for me to say plainly anymore, Nathaniel, because it stopped being complicated for me quite a while back. Nathaniel looked at her a long moment across the table in front of his daughter in the small warm kitchen that had somehow, sideways and without permission, become the center of both their lives. I love you, he said plainly. The way a man says things, he's finally stopped rehearsing. I should have found the nerve to say it before a hearing forced my hand. But I'd rather say it late than never at all. I know exactly when I started feeling it too, Clara answered. It was the night I sat up with you and you asked me why. I didn't have a good enough answer then. I've got one now. Josephine, watching the two of them, allowed herself the first real smile she'd worn since the buggy had rolled away down that dirt road. Judge Ashworth's courtroom in the county seat was small, plain, and far too warm for late autumn. Clara sat beside Nathaniel with Josephine wedged between them, holding both their hands beneath the table where the judge couldn't see, though everyone else in the room almost certainly could. Prescott's lawyer made his case with practiced polish. A hasty deathbed marriage, a dying man's judgment not to be trusted, a child's best interests better served by the stability and resources of the Prescott Ranch. Doc Farrow testified plainly that Nathaniel had been fevered, but entirely lucid the day of the ceremony, sharp enough to negotiate the terms of a legal bargain point by point, and that a man arguing terms that precisely wasn't a man out of his senses. Preacher Kane testified that he'd married a great many couples along his circuit and had never once married a man incapable of answering his own vows. And Nathaniel had answered his clean and fast before Kane had even finished the question. Then Judge Ashworth asked to speak with Josephine privately in his chambers, gently, without either set of grown-ups present. She went in pale and small and came out 20 minutes later looking, Clara thought, considerably steadier than she'd gone in. The judge took less than an hour to decide. This court finds no evidence whatsoever of duress, he said, and considerable evidence of a stable, established household. This court further finds that the child has expressed her own preference clearly enough that I see no cause to overrule it. Petition denied. Prescott left the courtroom without a single word to any of them. He didn't return to Cedar Hollow that winter, or the one after, though word eventually reached them, secondhand, that the harsh drought the old ranchers had long predicted for the territory finally arrived and cost him nearly half his flock. Proof, if anyone still needed it, that even the largest operation in the county answered to the weather, same as everybody else. Money or no money. Clara never managed to feel much beyond a tired sort of pity for the man. It was enough, eventually, that he simply faded out of their lives entirely. They stood together the following spring at the edge of the garden, watching the first green shoots come up where Clara had turned the soil the autumn before, back when she'd still been telling herself all of this was only temporary. Josephine was 7 now, tall enough that her boots no longer needed an extra sock stuffed in the toe, and she ran the fence line most evenings with a stray dog that had wandered onto the property in January and simply never left, the way certain things do once they've found the place they're meant to stay. Nathaniel worked the land fully again. Strength returned, the scar along his ribs the only remaining evidence of a winter that had nearly taken everything, and had instead, by some accounting, neither of them fully understood, handed them each other in its place. In the evenings, Clara sat in the rocking chair that had belonged to someone else once and was hers now, mending one of Josephine's dresses torn along the fence line, while Nathaniel sat across from her with his coffee, saying little, because she'd learned early on that his silences were a form of attention, never distance. I used to believe, Clara said, not looking up from her mending, that wanting something too badly was the most dangerous thing a person could do. And now, Nathaniel said, now I think not wanting it was the real danger, she answered. I nearly talked myself out of a very good thing because I was afraid of exactly this. She gestured with her needle toward the small warm room around them, toward the sound of a child's laughter drifting in from the yard, toward the man sitting across from her who had once been nothing but a stranger and a bargain, and was neither of those things any longer. Nathaniel reached across and took her free hand and didn't say a word, because there wasn't anything left that needed saying. Outside the window, the Montana evening settled over the homestead the way it did every single night. Ordinary, whole, and entirely theirs. Clara Whitmore climbed a staircase above a dry goods store to speak with a dying man, expecting to strike a bargain and see it through to a quiet, uneventful end. Instead, she got a family, arriving sideways through a fever that broke when it wasn't supposed to break. A girl who asked the hardest questions in the plainest language. A man honest enough to admit it even when honesty cost him something real. And a fight in a small, overheated courtroom that neither of them had gone looking for. But both of them showed up for anyway, together. Because by then, that's exactly what the word family had come to mean between them. I think often about how many of the good things in a life arrive dressed up as obligations, and how often they get tested right at the moment you're convinced the hardest part is finally behind you. Clara wasn't out looking for a husband or a daughter. She answered a knock because it was the decent thing to do. She stayed because she'd given her word and didn't know how to take it back. And when the real fight came, the one with lawyers and a judge and every single thing laid out on the table, she didn't have to invent an answer on the spot. She'd already worked it out quietly, over 2 months of mended shirts and fevered nights, exactly who she intended to stand beside. That's usually how it goes. The commitment gets made in small, unremarkable moments, long before anyone ever asks you to prove it under oath. And by the time the test finally arrives, if you've been honest in all those quiet moments leading up to it, the answer is already sitting there waiting for you to say it out loud. Thank you for riding along with me today. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, I'm glad you made the time. Until the next one, take care of the people worth staying for.